Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thank you for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. I have been so pleased and fortunate, honestly, to bring you several episodes now with Peter Newman, who's the founder of Peak Wealth Planning. They do financial management for folks with two specialties broadly, folks with a nest egg of $2 million or more, and they have a focus on the ESOP space. And I'm frankly not aware of any other financial planners, wealth managers with that focus. So this is our third episode with Peter, and I hope you'll go to our archives at www.esoppodcast.com and check out the previous two episodes. There's a lot of great information. Part one with Peter is a general look at issues people should be considering, maybe in their 40s and 50s, certainly as they approach retirement age, but younger as well. And it's kind of a general overview that I think is just really interesting, and Peter did a great job presenting. And the second issue is the deepest dive we've ever had on the ESOP podcast with diversification and distributions. We've certainly talked about it on a number of episodes, but Peter gave a kind of a deeper dive into the process and the questions to ask. So I hope that you'll check those out. And this third episode that we are recording and bringing you today, Peter is going to talk about the importance of companies providing financial well-being information and perhaps courses to their employees about their personal finances. We talk an awful lot on the podcast about open book management and sharing financials, whether it's formally or informally. And Peter takes it that next step to bringing the education on a personal nature. And without any further ado, Peter, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Bret, thank you for having me today. This has been a lot of fun and looking forward to our discussion today.
And you managed, Peter, to come up, when I was talking with you and your team members, you managed to come up with topics that I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'm like, I haven't had those topics on my podcast before. And with 500 some episodes, I've had just about every topic. So what you're talking about is really important and very interesting. And as I said earlier, very well presented. So Peter Newman, people can check part one for kind of a little bit of an expanded biography of you and Peak Wealth Planning. If you want to hear in that, we won't go into that again, but we do want to open up. Normally we ask our guests to share at the start of the podcast with their EO aha moment. It's not the moment that you first heard about employee ownership, but literally the moment where you went, aha, this could be something life-changing for you or for others. Do you have an aha moment you'd like to share?
I absolutely do, Bret. Before I learned about the employee ownership world, I worked in higher ed treasury, and I had been a real estate entrepreneur investor on my own. So the ways of planning for individual wealth for me, from my personal family background, were either you buy duplexes and you remodel them on the weekend, or you have friends who own apartment buildings, or you work with other professionals at a university or a company and you put as much money away as you can in your 401k. I had the very fortunate opportunity in late 2013 through my accountant to meet a gentleman who had worked at an employee-owned company for his entire career. And my accountant friend said, "Hey, Peter, you need to meet this person. He's thinking about retiring in a few years and he really needs help." So I went and met with this family in Chicago, and I learned that this gentleman was a tax director for Amstead Industries, making a six-figure salary, and started having a dialogue with him and learned that he had saved a modest sum in his 401k, less than $500,000, but that he had this company stock where he had balances of around $6 million. And previously he had taken $1 million out, or just over $1 million out, and put it in his IRA. So he had a $7.5 million net worth. And the majority of that, the bulk of that, was from working at a single company for the entire career. And then as I asked a few more questions, I was flabbergasted to learn that that stock was granted to him as part of his compensation. And that was quite a nest egg he could plan for and then later spend in retirement. So I actually had the very fortunate position to start Peak Wealth Planning with that gentleman who had worked at Amstead his entire career. And my second client was someone I went to college with that was an attorney that needed some financial planning. So that's how Peak Wealth Planning got launched. And so employee ownership really launched Peak Wealth Planning. The sort of follow on to that, having an entrepreneurial mindset, the next year, and I started in January 2014, we started the firm. And I thought, well, gee, I should learn more about this world of employee ownership. And I believe it was 2015 in the spring, I attended my first National Center for Employee Ownership conference. I think it was in Atlanta. And I was just stunned how much energy and investment employee owner companies put into good culture, camaraderie, as well as in many cases, not all, but in many cases, these companies practice some form of open book management, meaning they educate their employees about how their actions, whether you're a shipping clerk, you're a project manager, you are a frontline salesperson, on how your actions translate into the company doing well, and then try to link the company doing well to your ESOP account value and how that can be life-changing, just like it was for my first client. So I have found going to conferences now since 2015 for the last 8 years, whether it's the ESOP Association or the NCEO, the powerful stories of folks, whether they're a payroll clerk to the director or the VP of sales, all along the chain of everyone at every level in these companies, the really well-run ESOPs in good industries are a very attractive wealth building and potential source of significant steady retirement income. So for me, it's just been a delight to work in this area. And I've met so many wonderful professionals and employee owners too.
Peter, I love that on several different levels. And let me just tell you why. First of all, as a certified financial planner, as a wealth manager, you could take away, I said that you had two specialties, so a nest egg over $2 million, your area of expertise or where your firm specializes, nest egg over $2 million, and you have a specialization on the employee ownership. Your skill set has nothing to do with employee ownership per se. In other words, you could have anybody that met the financial level that you're working with, and you can provide them advice and you can help them with their management, et cetera, et cetera. But there are two really important things in my mind, as I've gotten to know you a little bit, about why it would be so important for those in employee ownership to work with someone like you who's got the knowledge of employee ownership. First of all, as people will hear, and I don't want to, overhype the other two episodes, but as people will hear, particularly on episode 2 of the diversification and distribution, you have the knowledge of how that works. You know to check the plans in the summary plan description. You know where to check in the summary and the plan description and the plan itself. So you have that built-in knowledge of the process and the life cycle of the employee-owned firms themselves. And it certainly puts you in a better, my fear would be, and you covered this beautifully, my fear would be that if a employee owner just went to a wealth manager and they said, hey, I got this diversification coming up, the wealth manager who doesn't know anything about employee ownership may just gut reaction say, diversify. And maybe that is the right answer, but that's for the wrong reasons. You're able to go through with the knowledge of diversification, with the knowledge of the company, maybe have a better sense of how that company is doing, and help your client, the employee owner, come to the right decision with the understanding of employee ownership. Does that make sense?
That makes a ton of sense. I had a client that I met about 3 years ago, and I worked with her on financial planning for 2 years. She was buying some real estate. We did some cash flow management for her and her extended family for goals that she had. And in our case, working with that family, we decided, and she was very confident in her company and the share value potential increase, we decided to not take diversification for a number of years and wait for some share value uplift. And we actually planned it so that the increase in price, and she knew the risk going in, would basically pay for Roth conversions on her individual retirement account. So I was on the phone with her this week, and we're hoping in the next 3 to 5 years to do massive Roth conversions. So she winds up with between $10 and $15 million in a Roth IRA that she'll never pay tax on. And when her kids inherit it in 30 or 40 years, they will not pay tax for the 10 years that they have that money. So we're talking lifetime generational wealth, where if you were just saying, well, I'm just going to diversify everyone immediately, you might have missed that about $4.5 to $5 million in uplift of share value. So it's really important to understand what's on the mindset of the employee, how much confidence they have in their company, make sure as a financial planner, they understand the risks and the reward of waiting. Inverse, I had a client who had diversified some at 55, doing financial planning with him. He's with a company down in Florida. Their share price actually decreased because of some exogenous variables to their business, and his account value went down several $1 million. He was at 6 million, he went up to 10, and then went back down to around 7 million. So you really have to look at all the angles before you make decisions. And I'll bring it back and put a little bit simpler bow around it. Oftentimes we've done the conversations, we know what your goals are. I do goals-based financial planning. What are we trying to achieve? Lifestyle, helping others, taking care of your long-term care, whatever's important to that family. Once we have the goals, we can assign dollars to those goals, and then we can line that out with the money you have saved, whether it's ESOP, 401k, IRA, selling apartment buildings. I have a couple of real estate clients, nothing to do with the ESOP world. So we marry those assets with these goals, and then we make decisions about investments and sales and timing. I don't want to give investment advice unless I've done your financial planning, whether you're an ESOP participant or a real estate person.
Peter, that is a great opportunity for us to point out, as we have on the other episodes, that nothing you are giving in this podcast or the other two podcasts are advice. There's a lot of information that's required, a lot of due diligence, and frankly, there are fees for what you do, in one way or another. So nobody should be listening to you on this podcast and taking it as specific advice to their situation. And the other disclaimer that we mentioned is that, a lot of things that we may talk about in various things are plan specific to the specific ESOP. So you and I are both speaking from a perspective of what we are familiar with and maybe what we usually see, but your plan could be absolutely different. So I've got those disclaimers out of the way. Peter, we want to talk about the company training their employees or working with their employees on better personal financial savvy. And I want to cue this up because some of the folks listening might be in the C-suite, to this episode, considering putting in such a program. And I always like to point out, we talk about an awful lot of culture things on the podcast, and we talk about the cool things that companies do that are giving back to their employees. And I always need to put it in the context of, and these are well-run, profitable companies. These are not, there's a value-added service to the employees. Maybe we're hyper-focused on an employee ownership because they're the employee owners, they are the shareholders. But at the same time, this isn't at the expense of the balance sheet. There are things that you can put into programs and it is just worth it. And the financial management that you're going to talk about, as I was thinking about it, the value to the companies of doing this is it's going to add to retention. If their employees are in a better sound financial shape and know about it, with everything that's going on, that's going to make for a more stable, productive workforce, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think in terms of this education, it's another thing that we're saying is kind of a best practice, but it's worth it, certainly in tangible and perhaps tangible ways, returns as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Bret. And, I did a little bit of research the last couple of years, and without going too deep into it, if you just survey employees across the country, more than half of employees are stressed about their finances. And there's some data that shows that employees that are stressed about money are more likely to have health issues that could potentially drive up insurance costs for a company. And there is some evidence that employees who are stressed spend, or depending on your view, might say waste 13 hours a month dealing with financial issues while at work. I'm talking from the managerial standpoint, right? To the employees, they're like, I got to solve this problem, right? So I'm going to make my phone call in between my sales calls. Unfortunately, in the US, only about a quarter of workers feel confident about being able to retire comfortably. And everyone's definition of comfort is different, but that generally means some type of income replacement and be able to have housing, healthcare, and eat, and maybe, go to the park or take a vacation. But, it's really important for folks to feel confident about their future. So translating that, one of the ways employee-owned companies can help their workforce is provide some type of financial wellness programs. And what I have seen is that having financial wellness programs will foster employee satisfaction as well as loyalty. Now, that's no guarantee people are going to stay forever, but it certainly is an added benefit, not unlike, free Cokes in the break room on Fridays or, a monthly happy hour. So it's just one more piece of the overall package, I would believe.
You had pointed out in your aha moment that your earliest experiences with employee-owned companies was the recognition that good ones were doing some form of open book management. And so it seems to me the personal wellness programs, financial wellness programs, are already akin to that. If you are taking the time to share financials and that sort of thing with your employees, you're halfway there to a personal wellness program. Am I saying that right?
Well, think about it this way. If you go through a great game of business or you go through Profit and Cash from Grit and you start understanding at a company level how income needs to be greater than expenses to have a profit, that's not terribly different than what Carl Richards puts on a note card in his financial planning diagrams that, used to show up. I think it was in the New York Times, but basically, his most basic advice is income has to be greater than expenses. And, that's budgeting 101. If you want to get ahead for your future, and if today's Peter wants to help future self Peter, I need to tuck away a little bit of money, whether it's an emergency savings account or for a goal to get a new car or a down payment on a car, or my goal to maybe someday have the option to retire. I'm not sure I will because I love what I do, but at least maybe have the option in case for some reason I can't keep working. So I think that there are actions employee-owned companies, many of them are already taking that translate into financial wellness. But then I think sometimes we as professionals have to help those companies take it a layer deeper. And with Peak Wealth Planning, we were asked in early 2022 to design a sort of a three audience program for a Chicago-based employee-owned company. And what we figured out is there were really three target audiences we could effectively cover in 3 different sessions. And the target audiences were folks just starting out, we'll just say in their 20s and 30s. And that was a Be Money Smart program. The second audience is people just say 30s to 50-ish, and that's financial wellness. And I would call that mid-career goals, life decisions. And then the third audience is nearing retirement, cash out, how do I turn my accumulated money into a retirement income stream? And what are all the overwhelming decisions I need to make as I'm thinking about retirement? So those are the 3 different audiences we look at trying to address. And that's our point of departure. And then what we will do, Bret, we'll have a conversation with the company, whether it's the HR person or the manager who brings us in, and say, all right, this is our starting point. And I can talk a little bit more detail about each one of those. This is our starting point. But then we'll say, are there things you're hearing from your employee cohorts that you want us to customize to the degree that we can?
So, Peter, give us an overview, if you will, about the kinds of information that would be presented to employees at an employee-owned company.
Absolutely. So for Money Smart, for folks just starting out, the topics we might educate or cover in a presentation, an initial presentation might be an education about budget. What does it mean to budget? What are the major components of a budget for someone in their 20s and 30s? For example, housing. Am I saving for a house or am I renting an apartment? What are some of the differences of those two? We'll talk about emergency savings and why having a shock absorber for life's unexpected events is important. And then we'll do a little bit on goal setting. What does it mean to set a financial goal? And why is having a specific goal important? Not everyone wants to do goal setting, but we talk about what's important to you and what are you trying to achieve. And we bring that back to goals and we bring it back to finances. We do a little bit of education about managing debt and what's good debt and what's bad debt and what does that mean. So we might think of bad debt as buying a 42-inch or let's say a 70-inch TV when you already have a 40-inch TV and you really need a car, but instead you bought a TV and you're paying 20% interest. So sort of trade-offs we make about goals versus the type of debt we're taking on. And then we'll do a little bit, it depends on if the company has already done this or not. Sometimes we'll do a reinforcement on the ESOP basics, how much maybe of your salary you're getting each year, and maybe what that might look like in 3 or 5 years for folks just starting out in terms of potential wealth, not guaranteed, but we'll do some forecasts. And then we might help explain or reinforce the difference between a 401k and the ESOP, and help folks remind them that they put a little bit of money in for the 401k, and the company, depending on the company, may or may not match the 401k. So that's kind of a teaser of the half dozen items we'll cover in a Money Smart initial workplace wellness. And then what we try to do, Brett, is make those interactive. And then as a follow-up, companies are not required to do this, but we will sell a package of one-on-one phone calls with myself or another member of our team, where if a person wants to go deeper on a particular issue, they would have an hour budget to say, all right, well, after the Money Smart program, you sent us a budget worksheet. I did a budget, I created one. I want to do a one-on-one Zoom with Peter and have a conversation about my budget, right? We might not take that person on as a planning client for the rest of their lives, but we'll make ourselves a resource to do a follow-up for that Money Smart, or the company can do a train the trainer program and have a peer program and do that internally, right? To the degree they're comfortable. So there's different ways after the initial session that can be moved forward, but that's the just starting out track, or the what I call the Money Smart track. And then there's 2 other tracks I can talk about as well.
I love, Peter, and we'll get to the second track in just a moment, but I love, as you were describing some of the things that you look about and the trade-offs of, debt that you're taking on and the interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. To me, and I've been in business all of my life, self-employed most of my life, and to me, it's so easy to bring that back to what's going on in the company. Even the basics of income needs to exceed expenses. It's makes it so relatable with a lot of the company information they're already getting. So people will say, oh, here's another touch at financial knowledge.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think about it, depending on where you are in the company, you may be aware of the company's cost of capital. Well, that's not terribly different than, am I borrowing money from a home equity loan? This is maybe someone a little older than in their 20s. But am I borrowing money from a home equity loan at 6%, or am I financing this purchase at the car dealer at 9%, assuming interest rates go up a little bit more? Or am I putting my down payment on my credit card for XYZ vehicle that's a little bit of a stretch for me, and I'm paying 20% interest plus a car loan? So having those different frames of references in the employee workplace or the workplace can translate into, what does that mean for my personal budget, especially when you start to understand, well, 20% interest on $20,000 is $4,000 a year, but 6% interest on $20,000 is $1,200 a year. It's a lot lower. Break that down monthly, it's $100 a month versus almost $400 a month. So starting to put those pieces in place, I think, is really important. And to the degree companies do open book management and educate employees on things like cost of capital, that can translate into what happens in my personal life.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's go to the second program, those who are kind of in the middle of their career years.
Yeah, the middle program our general program is called Financial Wellness, but our middle program is called Financial Wellness. How do I balance competing financial priorities, and what mid-career goals and decisions do I need to be thinking about? So oftentimes mid-career folks maybe haven't thought a whole lot about retirement, but we like to do a retirement check-in. And we have a grid that's pretty straightforward that says, how old am I? I'm 45. I make X dollars per year. And then we have a multiplier on that grid, and we say, you should have 3 times your salary or 5 times your salary saved on this grid. And that's a way for someone to do a quick cocktail napkin check-in on, hey, have I saved enough if I'm 40 years old and I make $80,000 or $150,000 a year in my nest egg? And then what we can do with that is have a conversation if people haven't hit that goal of, okay, well, it's not the end of the world. Let's talk about what levers you can pull. Maybe your spouse is a super saver and he or she actually has a lot more nest egg, or Maybe your spouse is a school teacher and they actually have a pension. So the nest egg, while important, is not the only thing you're going to rely on in retirement. So, or we might say, making $80,000 a year, I'm not quite where I want to be on this grid, but I know I'm going to get a promotion because I'm doing a really good job for my employee-owned company. And I'm going to bank all of my promotions starting at age 45 until age 55. So that's one piece as a retirement check-in. The other piece, because folks become usually a lot more aware of financial issues in their mid-30s, early 40s, before 50s, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about where are you saving now? What sources of luggage? Does your company offer a health savings account? Maybe you're already doing the 401k. So what other luggages should you be saving in for your life journey along financial wellness? And then we'll go a little deeper too on if you have competing financial priorities, how do you balance those? I was working with a family a couple of years ago, high income earners, 2 children. And when we started working with them, they were saving in a 401k. The wife was a stay-at-home mom. The gentleman made a very high income as a general counsel, but they did not have any 529 or college savings. So we had a discussion around, well, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? And one of their goals was, we don't want our kids saddled with a lot of college debt. And they were 8 and 11 years old. And I said, well, what do you do with your bonus every year? And so we had a dialogue around, well, should the bonus every year for this gentleman go into college savings accounts? And we had a goal, want to put some money aside for kids, don't want my kids to have a lot of debt when they come out of college. So what resources do we have? And interestingly, with this family, we also did some forecasting, our grid, and we looked at this and we said, you're not quite where you need to be in terms of the grid and at age 38 relative to your salary. By the way, this is not uncommon for people that have had pretty big salary increases through their career. If your salary has gone up a lot, oftentimes you have to save a lot more than you think to replace that income or get close to it in retirement. If your salary only goes up 2 or 3% a year, nothing wrong with that, but it's a little bit easier to save for retirement to replace your income. If your salary goes up at 15% a year for 5 or 10 years, it's a lot harder to adjust your savings rate to do some income replacement and have a big nest egg. So we had to do a lot of work with this family around budget and cash flow to help them decide whether it was important enough to them to replace, a $300,000 a year income in retirement, or were they okay with the $100,000 a year income in retirement? And those are 2 very different lifestyles in retirement. So we had some really interesting conversations, even down to, and most families don't want us to do this, but when we do our workshops with companies, we'll talk about budget hacks. So we had some real conversations about, well, how do you save money on eating out? And we were down to the discussion of, well, we keep like granola bars in the car for the kids so we don't go through McDonald's, or we cook food together as a family on the weekend instead of going out to eat 4 nights a week. I don't know if you've noticed, Brett, but inflation in terms of dining out has skyrocketed meals out, whether it's a lunch or a dinner.
I got to tell you, Peter, I've been divorced since 2016, and starting during COVID, I frankly eat almost every meal, and I mean almost every single meal out in restaurants. And inflation is huge, not just there, but across the board. I will tell you, and boy, this could be a different episode, so I don't want to go any further. But at the same time, people blame politicians for inflation. I can't help but notice that the big companies who often have cornered the market in various fields are making record profits. So I don't know that inflation, and I am not an economist. I mentioned in the previous podcast, I'm not investment savvy at all, but I can't help but notice that what is called inflation, which should be economic, seems to be borderline profiteering by a part of a lot of companies. And I apologize for getting preachy there, but it is outrageous. And the other thing that occurred to me, Peter, is, you'd mentioned the example of the client who had children that they wanted to address for college, and that's certainly worthy. But it's whatever your goal is, and you'll work with them to figure out their goal. You've referenced at various times, it's not unusual for someone 55 or 60 to leave regular employment and open their own business in one sort or another. Hey, I want to strike out on my own. And that's something, if someone has a goal at 40 that they would like to be in a position at 55 or 60 to leave gainful employment or regular employment and open their own business, that whatever the goal is, you just help them figure out what's attainable and the best path to reach it.
Absolutely. And when we are doing a session with the company on mid-career goals and decisions, we will often poll the folks on the Zoom call, or if we're doing it in person, what's important to you. And as long as they're comfortable sharing, we'll have a quick dialogue. Well, how do you think you would meet that goal? Try to make it as meaningful and real for the folks participating in that session. And so I think it's really important, to the degree that we can, the degree folks are willing to participate. And we've seen some pretty good participation in the ones we've done so far. If folks participate, then we can give sort of, it's not individual personal advice, but if we were in your situation, here's some steps you might want to think about. Execution's up to you because you're not a client of our firm, but here's the levers, or the key levers we have seen in other situations that you might want to think about pulling for yourself, pulling those key levers. And by the way, when we were talking about the food, I'm just going to mention this because I think it's quite interesting. I eat my own cooking, right? We usually go out to eat once a week, but my partner and I, almost every week, we plan our menus. I know I told you on the last episode that we're big gardeners. So our food for the week is driven by what comes out of the garden, what do we want to eat, and what meals do we want to cook. Usually we cook on Sunday or Saturday, and we try not to cook the rest of the week unless we're just heating up something or cooking up something real quick that takes 5 minutes, because I like to work out. We have friends we like to hang out with. We like to play board games. So there's a lot of different things I want to do during the week. And for me, I don't want to cook meals every night. My brother loves to cook. He goes to the grocery store 5-6 days a week and cooks these really amazing meals every night. I do not want to do that. We cook amazing meals on the weekend. We parse them out and we have them for the week. Someone was joking with me when I was in university, you're like an old man. I'm like, well, I may be, but I eat the food I want to eat, and I'm not spending $700 a week on dining out. If other folks want to spend $700 a week on dining out, all for them. I'm all good with that.
Well, and you raise the point that it's whatever the person wants to do with their life. And, for some, it might be, hey, I want to have a place down at the beach, or at least a timeshare somewhere. And I don't recommend timeshares, from what I understand. So I'm just, throwing that out. But whatever it is, it's having that knowledge and then applying the knowledge. You'll give the overview and the company will provide this. And again, just as you want the employee owners, in a well-run ESOP to be focused on the same goals, all you're doing, and we both said this earlier, is extending that to your personal, whatever the goals are. Your role is to provide the overview in these sessions on how you might get there and things to do to make that more practical. And that is just tremendous advice that I certainly wish I had access to, at the younger points in my career.
Bret, before we go on, something you said earlier reminded me. So when we're doing the company training sessions, if someone's with a partner or a spouse at home, we're typically talking to one individual. However, when we work with families, we generally require all adult members of a household who are contributing income to be part of our financial planning process. Because what I've learned doing this now for a decade is you really need all the people with oars in the water as part of financial planning. And if we're talking about folks transitioning to retirement as part of the retirement planning discussion, it doesn't mean every spouse has to be involved at the same level, but it's really important to me in my practice to know that if the woman is the key decision maker and driver, that the gentleman at least knows, hey, if something happens to Juanita, I can still call up Peter, and Peter knows who I am, or Peter's admin knows who I am, so I'm not left in the dark completely. So I generally try to require folks to at least both participate on the front end financial planning process and at least participate once a year in an annual meeting, so they know what's going on and they have some confidence that their finances are being, well looked after.
So Peter, let's go on to the third group, those who are closest in retirement age.
Absolutely. The third part of our program we call cash out decisions and transitioning to retirement. And as we discussed in the prior episode, and I won't go as deep right here, but for our workshop participants, we will talk about diversification decisions, pros and cons of diversifying. We'll ask folks what they think about diversifying, how they think their company stock is doing, and then we will tailor our presentation at that company to that company's retirement timeline and distribution plan. More importantly, during the wellness and transitioning to retirement workshop, ask folks to do a visioning exercise. What's your vision for retirement? And we'll do it interactively during the workshop. But then in addition, we have a little guidebook we send out to people that says, what do you want? And that's a post-workshop giveaway that we'll send out to them. But that's really that visioning part of where are you in your life personally? What are things you haven't accomplished you might want to accomplish? A lot of us have, unmet dreams we want to try to look at doing, whether those dreams are small, I want to volunteer for the Boys and Girls Club, or those dreams are big, which we've talked about several times. I want to start a business, or maybe I want to move to another country. So it really depends on what's important to these folks. And then what we'll talk about after we do the visioning exercise is we'll do an exercise and we'll demonstrate, and we'll usually take cohorts from that company at different income levels and different ESOP balance levels, and we'll show or illuminate how their 401k and their ESOP could generate a steady stream of income at retirement. And then we'll layer in guaranteed income sources like Social Security. The flip side of that income piece is we'll talk about, is your goal income replacement, or do you have higher aspirations like I'm going to buy a vacation home, or you say, I'm actually pretty content, I'm not going to move, my mortgage is paid off, so I think my expenses are going to go down. And then we'll talk a little bit about, well, that all may be true, but here's some things maybe you haven't yet considered, because most of us get one act for retirement. And having coached people for the last decade through retirement, we have some knowledge in our practice of, here's some things we've seen come up that folks might not expect. For example, I have to commute a lot more because every day I have to go and help my elderly parents, and I wasn't expecting to need to do that. Or if I can't go help them, they can't afford it, and I actually have to pay for a caregiver to go in there 5 afternoons a week. So is that a delight and a joy? No, but honestly, these are real life things that come up. So we try to illuminate for folks, here's some things you haven't thought of that may change, or I'm going to retire at 63 and I've got 2 more years before Medicare. So I might need to budget $20,000 a year for myself and my spouse to pay for health insurance until I hit Medicare age. And then the other issue we eliminate for folks is most of us think Medicare is free. It's not, unfortunately. There's some premiums that have to be paid. And depending on your income and retirement, those premiums can be 190 to 500 or 600 bucks a month. It really varies by your income level. So there's changes that we need to plan for as part of that transition to retirement. And in our workshop, we try to illuminate the key decisions folks might have to make. And then for folks that elect to work with us down the road as financial planning clients, we coach them through those decisions and get into the nitty gritty on it.
I have to smile, Peter. I'm kind of laughing at myself so that I don't cry. But I'm 60 years old. I turned 60 the summer of 2023. And honest to goodness, as you were just speaking, I was like, wait, I'm going to have Medicare premiums? So I had no clue. And that's, again, just the importance of speaking with someone like yourself. And I love the fact that, first of all, that you have these tiers together, the 3 tiers available to provide to the companies. I think it's really important. It would be, in my mind, easy to say, well, we don't need it for the young ones because they're not focused on retirement, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that goes against kind of the spirit of what the ESOP is. It would be the same thing of, the ESOP itself is technically a retirement plan. I actually just did a mini cast saying, don't call it that because it's so much more than that. But it would be the same thing as saying, we're not going to bother with the younger employees because they're not retiring for 30 or 40 years, as opposed to getting them involved and getting them knowledgeable with the personal financial wellness, because and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it just ties all the pieces together. The company's financial data, the company's health and financial fitness, and tying that with their own, I think is just really important and certainly fits in the vibe with the best of employee-owned companies.
Absolutely. And even though technically under the IRS and Department of Labor, ESOPs are retirement vehicles, tax-deferred retirement savings vehicles, more recently when I've been at conferences and talked to CFOs and HR directors, some of the internal speak at companies is starting to talk about it as a wealth building vehicle. And part of the reason for that is attracting and retaining key staff in today's current market environment for talent. So it's really important to think about your messaging as well at these businesses. And I think we had mentioned too in one of our earlier episodes, Bret, that it's not very common at all, but some ESOPs are considering, if they can afford it, and if management and senior leadership are buying in, whether they can pay a dividend to get some of this wealth out to folks who need to buy their first home or have their first child or make some other life event decision at age 30 or 35. I think you have to be careful with that as a plan administrator. You don't want too much money coming out too early, because you do want folks to still save for their nest egg. But I think it's a balancing act these companies need to think about.
I've got to say, Peter, and I never ran into any dividends when I was a trustee. And, as I've shared with you and our listeners, regular listeners know, I was an ESOP trustee for 7 years, and I don't think I came across dividends. And on the one hand, if the circumstances were absolutely perfect, and that included flush with cash, all the repurchase obligations are manageable for the foreseeable future, and you have the type of business that, you don't necessarily have huge swifts in costs, et cetera, I could see where there'd be some interest in the dividends. But yeah, keeping the money in the account, just as with my former trustee hat on, or keeping the money with the business, it seems to me I'd rather invest it in business operations, as a way to get it back. But I certainly get the appeal of dividends being sent out. And Peter, your point about, wealth building, you're absolutely right. Calling it wealth building as opposed to don't call it an ESOP is just messaging. Important messaging, huge messaging, but it's messaging. And what better way to reinforce the message if what your company is doing is, hey, let's portray this as wealth building, also bringing in a firm like yourself to do personal financial wellness is a great way to reinforce that very important message of wealth building.
Yeah, it sends the right message regardless of which of the three cohorts we're speaking about, for sure. So what we have done, Bret, and I know you've met Carmen, our marketing director, for companies that are interested, if you're hearing this podcast, you can schedule a visit with myself and Carmen, and we'll have a conversation with you about your company's ESOP, and then we can talk through these three cohorts and what type of program you might like customized to your specific company's needs. We typically will do a single presentation for one price that we customize, or we'll do a 3 presentation package for the 3 different cohorts. And then we have an add-on package if folks want to buy vouchers for one-on-one retirement income forecast or a financial planning consult call with myself or another member of our team. That's an option as well. And then, as we mentioned through the podcast today, following those workshops, we typically have resources we send out, and then folks can use those in that 1-hour consult with us to get a particular question answered or addressed.
I love that. And I hope that companies will take advantage and give some thought. I hope some light bulbs have gone off during this episode where some companies will say, wow, this is an important program. And it's one of those things, Peter, that it's an extension. You mentioned in previous podcasts, the great game of business and grit. It's an extension on the personal level of the sort of things that those folks are doing. And the one difference is that although there may be others in the ESOP space with an ESOP focus who are doing what you're doing, I'm not aware of it. And I'm always careful to say I'm not the end all be all, but then talking about employee ownership is primarily what I do. So I love the fact that, first of all, you are great at education, your personality and demeanor. You're obviously a bright guy, but you come across in a way that makes it very digestible, makes it not frightening, that, hey, here's where it's at. And there's kind of a comfort of, all right, I got this with, your guidance, et cetera, et cetera. So I really hope the companies would avail themselves and reach out to you and Carmen. And, I'll also say that, I've had the pleasure of working with Carmen a little bit. She's the one who reached out to me initially on your behalf about you doing the podcast. And she has just been wonderful to work with, has things very much together. So I imagine if companies reach out to you or her, they'll be very well taken care of by your team.
Absolutely. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this. It was a lot of fun, and I hope we get to work together in the future.
Well, I hope so too, Peter. This is the third of what have been 3 great episodes with Peter Newman of Peak Wealth Planning. The first episode is a general broad overview, but really interesting look at the ESOPs as a retirement plan and what that goes into. The second one, as I had said, is a deep dive on diversification and distributions, which I think is very important. And this episode, of course, on personal financial wellness provided by the companies. Peter Newman of Peak Wealth Planning. Your contact information is going to be on our website. We're going to include other things in the show notes. But thank you so much for your time and expertise. I appreciate it. I appreciate all of the information over 3 episodes that you brought to the listeners.
Thank you.
And with that, I finally want to thank you, the listener. I appreciate you very much. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at ESOP Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.